Hi, I'd like to talk to you about what Nintex Workflow 2010 adds to the SharePoint 2010 workflow story. We get a lot of questions, and we understand them. Questions like, workflow improved a lot in SharePoint 2010. SharePoint Designer's better. Visio allows for graphical workflow design. Do I really need anything more now? Or questions like, Nintex Workflow 2010 looks good, but how much of it is really just a nicer reworking of the functionality that SharePoint already provides? Like, for example, site workflows or reusable workflows or the use of info path forms for workflow startup forms and task forms. Well, we have answers. So everything you're about to see is something that is not delivered by SharePoint out of the box. It's also not offered by SharePoint Designer. And finally, it's not offered by Visio either. So let's get started. First off, you have the ability to design, deploy, and manage everything about workflow from within SharePoint itself. So start in SharePoint, stay in SharePoint while you're designing workflows, draw and configure workflows at the exact same time. We don't separate the drawing out of the workflow logic from the configuring of the workflow steps. And then you can immediately, once you publish it, use your finished designs. No desktop installs, no extra anything. Just stay inside of SharePoint and get work done. It's easy to learn, and it's even easier to master. There's a very easy drag and drop graphical designer built into every copy of Nintex Workflow and therefore built into every SharePoint site. And that designer is optimized to help you get more work done faster with fewer clicks, fewer pop-ups, fewer busy steps. There's one dialog box for every single workflow setting. When you configure an action, there's one ribbon bar to set everything. No popping around, no random work. Just get work done quickly and easily. And finally, we haven't made a lot of noise about this, but the fact that we draw all the lines and guide you through the design of the workflow means you're not going to miss any accidental paths the workflow might take. We'll make sure that workflow makes sense, and we validate it every step of the way with every step you take. It's also really easy to use the workflows it designs. So lazy approval has been around for some time, but it's still incredibly useful. It lets you complete a workflow task by simply replying to an email. There's also roll-up views of every single workflow task waiting for you, no matter where it lives, in which site, in which collection, in which web application, anything in your SharePoint environment. And you can easily also take action on and monitor the progress of all workflows you started, no matter where they live as well. On that note, you can track and analyze everything. The progress of a workflow has been something we've been able to track since our first release in 2007, and SharePoint 2010 now offers this through Visio services if and only if you've got enterprise client access licenses. And that's great, more power to them. But that's where that story stops. It happens to be where our story starts. So we can start with tracking one workflow, both graphically and as a tabular audit trail, but then we can go ahead and do performance statistics on that and show you how long it takes normally, maximum and minimum, how often it's run, how often it errors out, how often it's overdue, how often it's completed on time. We can identify bottlenecks in the process and bottlenecks in the participants. We can also do step-by-step profiling at every step of the workflow to help you figure out what's going on. Moreover, we can show you who's completing which tasks, both across the board or for individual users, or specifically targeted to the current user viewing a portal or a MySite. We can monitor user workloads, who's been given the most work, who's keeping up with that work, who delegates a lot, who's letting things fall behind. And we can audit which workflows are getting completed, which ones get canceled, which ones are overdue. We can handle status updates. You will know what's going on. The right hand will know what the left hand is doing. There's also a really easy way to reuse your hard work. User-defined actions are a brand new feature we introduced in SharePoint 2010 that actually they're for Nintex Workflow 2010 for SharePoint 2010. And user-defined actions allow you to create a workflow with input and output parameters, and therefore save it to the toolbox so it can be used as if it were a piece of code in other workflows. So, reuse building blocks of logic that you created without writing a single line of code. And when you want to kick things up a notch and have two completely independent workflows talk to each other, you can do that, again, without writing a single line of code. And finally, we've had this around since early 2007, but templates, they're everywhere, they're easy to create, they're easy to modify, and they're easy to share. You can also secure and govern every step of every workflow and the entire workflow environment as a whole. So you control access to design privileges, and you control access to individual workflow actions. You can also enforce the review of changes to workflow or new workflows when they're created in production collaboration style sites. And for more formal deployments, we absolutely support a develop to test to production stage deployment model. And then you have the ability to version workflow designs and go back to old versions or grandfather running instances and make sure everything runs smoothly and nothing gets disrupted as you evolve and enhance your workflow processes. Workflows really ought to look like business diagrams and not like program flowcharts. And the more busy work steps you add to a diagram, the less it becomes easy to understand. We'll help you out with this in a big way. When you're configuring tasks, you've probably gotten used to seeing things like the ability to choose someone's manager automatically out of a pick list. Well, that's not an automatic variable. We're providing that. By default, we do an Active Directory lookup, but in Nintex Workflow 2010, for SharePoint 2010, we've added the ability to change the way each and every one of these metadata items is calculated. So by default, we still do an Active Directory lookup, but you can change it to a lookup of the SharePoint User Profile Store, or a database, or a third-party LDAP provider, or anything you'd like. You can even add new kinds of metadata to suit your own needs. Real-world workflow logic usually involves things like looping, doing something over and over again, or doing the same thing to a whole set of individual items, or moving back and forth between stages in a workflow if you have to send something back to get worked on, or updated, or recirculate it for review, or send it off for special handling. These things are not esoteric tricks for workflow specialists. These represent real-world, everyday business logic. We're capable of designing all of them, again, using techniques that normally require the use of Visual Studio. We also have conditional start rules that we've introduced in 2010. This gives you the ability to register any of a number of workflows to react to a change to an item or the creation of an item or a document, and have the workflow decide whether or not to fire based on a value on a property or a value about the user or a comparison of an old value to a new value. Finally, and we've had this for a while, but it's still a big value add, we give you the ability to schedule a workflow for execution at a later point in time, and the ability to repeat it on a regular basis. You can connect to content across your entire SharePoint farm. You're not limited to operating on content within one site. You can hit things in other sites in the same collection, other site collections, other web applications, everything. You can also get to external data and methods using any of a number of industry standard protocols or well-published methods. And finally, you can reach more SharePoint functionality like Word services and Excel services and user profiles, business connectivity services, which is a gateway to a wide variety of different data sources and applications, and even SharePoint Search for structured property-based queries. And that's not all. It's not just for SharePoint functionality, it's for other products too. BizTalk Server, Exchange Server, Active Directory, CRM, Office Communication Server, now known as Link. We can talk to all of it, and it's right in the box. So if you look at the contribution Nintex Workflow makes to SharePoint's workflow story, We can talk about it in terms of what we add to SharePoint Workflow. We've been doing that for years. We add a graphical design environment built into every copy of SharePoint. We add over 100 actions for creating best-of-breed workflows, from the simple to the extremely complex. And we add an entire management dimension to the SharePoint workflow equation. And all of that's great. But it might be a really good idea to look at what we do to the SharePoint workflow picture. We make workflow truly easy, from the simple to the incredibly elaborate. We also make it extremely powerful at the exact same time, without you having to write a line of code and without adding anything to the complexity of your SharePoint deployment. No extra servers, no extra services. We let you model real work by accessing the types of logic real workflows demand, because rarely is life linear. And finally, we make the whole thing governable. We bring workflow to everyone. And if you'd like to look at it from a different point of view, put another way, if you were to take Nintex Workflow away from SharePoint, you can't implement real workflow logic without code. You can't start workflows based on conditions. You can't see all workflow activity across multiple sites. You can't see which users have the heaviest workloads. You can't put workflow changes through an approval process. You can't approve requests or complete tasks while you're offline. You can't complete tasks from a mobile device without development. You can't change a workflow without returning to one or more extra applications and going through a multi-app cycle to make updates. You can't keep your workflow from looking like a code flowchart if it's got any complexity whatsoever. You can't save and reuse pieces of one workflow in another workflow. You can't schedule workflows. You can't reach out to external data or SharePoint service apps. You can't design workflows quickly and easily. And you really can't offer workflow to everyone. Any questions?